grant applications. So this is kind of part of a two-part workshop as such. So we're going to do another workshop next week, I think it is, on preparing online grant applications. So this morning I'm going to focus on the kind of preparatory work you need to do when you're looking to source grants, where you find information about grants, what information you need to gather for your grants, and to have an application ready and be ready to apply when these things come up. And then on the online application workshop, we'll focus on the actual kind of writing the grant application, because we'll be doing a kind of dummy online application with you. So that will kind of cover the contents of an application form and what goes into an application form in terms of the wording that you would use when you're actually completing the application. So a lot of people worry about the application forms in terms of I don't know, to write one, or what do I put in, or what do I include, or how should I word certain sections of it. But the real work in terms of grant applications is the work you do beforehand, in terms of having everything ready for the grant and the application itself, because the key part of the application process is the supporting documentation that's required to go with the application. And a lot of people leave it to last minute to do the application, because I think it's only an application form. It'll take me a couple of hours to do it. I'll write the application form, I'll send it in, and everything will be great. And then you get to the application form a day before the application deadline, and they realize that there's a whole series of documentation that they have to provide with the application that they don't have access to, or they don't have at all. And they're now aware that they're not eligible, or they can't actually get the application in time. So a lot of groups miss out on applications. They miss deadlines, not because they have no idea what they're doing, but they have no idea what they need to provide, and they don't have the information in time because they don't have the information at hand ready to submit with the application form. So we're going to talk about that this morning. We're going to talk about the sources of information on grant aid and where you find out where grants are available and when grants are available, how to make a decision whether it's worth your while applying for a grant or not, which sounds like a crazy thing, but in some cases we would recommend groups not to apply for grants. We look at why grants are refused, and we look at the key parts of grant application in terms of the work you need to do before you write the grant application, what you need to have in place. So there's a good few people here, so I might ask you all to introduce yourselves, because we'll be here for another 15-20 minutes just doing introductions. So what I might ask you to do, if you want to put up in the chat, just if there's any specific grants that you're going to be applying for over the next, that you're aware of, that you're applying for, that you want maybe some advice or support on, I can take those down later on in the workshop and give you some information, or email some information on to you afterwards in relation to those specific grants. As Caroline is saying, this workshop is going to be recorded, so you can go back over it again, and I'll also be sending out the slides as a PDF document, and I'll also be sending you, as I've been doing in the past, links to other access to information online that you can use as well in relation to grants. So I'm going to share the screen with you now. That's okay. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along. Raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question, because I'm conscious that some people mightn't get this. By some things there that mightn't be aware of, or might just need more information on. So please feel free to ask questions as we go on. Okay, so can everyone see this? Okay.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's make this a bit bigger here so I can see. Great, perfect. So just quick introduction to who I am. I know some of you have been on the course before, some of you haven't been, so very, very quickly, give a quick overview of what I do. So I'm 20 years working within the sector. I suppose what's most relevant for this morning's workshop is that majority of work I do is around planning, business planning, strategic planning, feasibility study analysis for organizations who are applying for grants. And another part of my work I do is we do grant applications for groups. So suppose since 1998, we've been involved I've been involved in putting applications together for funds for various different projects of all different types and scale and size. And big part of the work is getting groups ready so that they're actually able to apply for grants. So we do a lot of work around planning and putting together the rationale behind why they're looking for funding. And these could be like, projects that are, tens of thousands of euros or hundreds of thousands of euros, or in some cases, multi-million euro projects that require a serious level of analysis and detail before they can actually even apply for the funds. So what I'll be doing this morning is taking my learning and my experience over the last 20 odd years in terms of what we do when we're trying to put our best foot forward, or our organization we're working for, their best foot forward, and making sure that they've got the best possible chance of getting a grant. So if we're being paid to do grant applications, there's a lot of pressure on us to make sure that they've a very good chance of getting that grant. Otherwise, our reputation won't be much good if no one gets any funding after we do work with them. So we spend a lot of time, I suppose, looking at what are kind of the areas that you need to focus on when writing grants, putting applications together. And I've also been on the other side as well, where I've looked and assessed the grant applications, so I know what they're looking for in terms of when they're assessing applications. We get a lot of feedback as well from departments and local authorities and leader companies on grants that were unsuccessful, to see how they can be improved going forward. So I'm going to try to impart as much knowledge as I can over the next 2 hours to you on what we've learned over the last 20 years in terms of doing this. So the key thing really, and I know some of you might have been on the financial planning workshop we did before Christmas, and a lot of preparing for grants is about really understanding what you need money for. So there's a lot of organizations out there that we call grant chasers, like the ambulance chasing. They chase every single grant that's going, and a lot of boards would say to their managers, coordinators, look, if there's a grant out there, it's free money, go after it and trying to get it. And that's kind of a waste of time in a lot of cases. It's not very efficient, it's not very effective, and to be honest, sometimes if you're successful in getting those grants, those additional grants that you bring in actually cause you more problems than they're actually worth, in terms of they add to administration costs, they add to overall operational costs, and sometimes the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy and administration involved in drawing down the grants is just onerous and does cause problems for groups. So we always say to groups, identify what you need the money for, be very clear on what you need money for, and then be very clear in terms of how you're going to fund those projects. And if there is grants specifically available for those type of projects, absolutely go for them, but don't start creating projects just to secure funding. Okay, so if you're working in an organization and you've seen an application for funding for whatever type of project, and you think, okay, but that's not really relevant to us, but it's free money, so we'll go after it. That's not the best practice. A lot of groups do it, and it just causes more problems than the work the grant is worth. So look at what you need money for. So operational costs, very difficult to get grant aid for operational costs. So very difficult to get grant aid for staffing costs, for utilities, for rent, for ongoing costs. You need to probably fund those through other sources like fundraising, fee income, sponsorship, that sort of stuff. There is some core grant aid out there for certain organizations that do cover operational costs, but for the majority of organizations, operational costs are rarely covered in grants, under grants. The reason for that is because your operational costs are ongoing. They're going to be there every week, every month, every year for as long as you exist. Grants are very short term. So if an organization gives you grants to cover operational costs for maybe 12 months, what happens after 12 months is up and the grant is gone? You're now back to square one again. So, running your organization based on grants isn't sustainable because you're always reliant on those grant aid. Now, as I said, there is core funded projects like HSC funded projects or TUSLA funded projects that are subsidized by those bodies, but they also have the shorter funding coming in. But typically, smaller organizations that are not core funded, you won't get grant aid for operational costs. Again, looking to reserve policy, we covered that before in the financial workshops. The reason why reserve policy is important when it comes to grant aid is that you need to have matching funds. So every organization should be looking to put in some money away every year that they can have in an account, that when they do need to come up and some matching funds, they have some money themselves to bring towards a project. You might need funding for feasibility studies. And again, there's grant aid for that. That grant is specifically to do an analysis of a project before you go for larger scale funding, right? So let's say you're doing a building project, adding an extension onto a community centre, and it's going to cost you €1 million. Before you go off and spend and trying to raise €1 million or trying to get grant aid for €1 million, you've got to prove that this project is feasible and viable. And you would get funding to do that initial analysis before you go off and decide to invest in and try to secure funding for the larger project. So there is grant aid for that. And then you have, I suppose, what most projects go after is capital funding for things like equipment, for materials, for building projects. And then you also have project costs, like say you might have a project you want to do which requires maybe training, like this has been funded through grant from the Wheel under training links. So that's a training grant. You have maybe research and development grants that you can apply for as well. And they're all one-off kind of small kind of pilot funding. So the majority of our work is around these two. We do feasibility studies that are funded through grant support, mainly through local development companies. And we do a lot of work then around securing funding for capital projects. So things like sports capital funding for sports clubs, leader applications for community volunteer organizations and for private companies. And then the larger scale projects like Rural Regeneration Development Fund and Urban Regeneration Development Fund, which is multi-million euro capital funding projects. So there's a lot of grants out there of all different sizes and scale for different things. And sometimes you can be kind of buried in the amount of grants that are available and what might be applicable to you and not applicable to you. So what we're going to focus on today really is looking at doing the research initially to see what's actually available to you, what's applicable to you, and what's worth going for. So again, we're looking at costs. Again, look at your costs regularly. And again, if you're looking at your cost structure and looking at funding and grants, if what you're doing doesn't really add any revenue, if there's no real return on what you're putting money into or you're trying to get funding for, I'd question why you do it. Again, if it doesn't benefit the strategic direction, in other words, if you're doing something that's not really relevant to what you're about, if it doesn't really match what your organization's objectives are, but you're just doing it because there's a grant for it, again, I'd question that. And we would always question our clients. We would always ask them, why are you going for this grant? Why are you bothered even looking for it? There's nothing to do with what you do. There's no point in going for it. And sometimes, we stop, but we can encourage people from not going for a grant. So if you could unmute, if that's okay. Mute, sorry. There's a feedback from that's fine. Okay, thanks. So again, if it's one-off funding, and this is something that I really want to make sure that you get to understand, is that there's a lot of grant data out there that are for pilot projects, okay? They're one-off funding for specific pieces of work with a specific start date and finish date, okay? So the dormant accounts funding that was there for many, many years, where it was always based around pilot funding, get projects off the ground, get them established, get the initiatives off the ground, and then once they're up and running, you have to kind of manage them yourself afterwards and finance them yourself afterwards. Pilot funding projects are okay if you have a long-term plan in place to manage those projects afterwards. And if you don't have a plan in place to manage those projects afterwards, what happens is when the funding stops and there's no longer funding available for the project normally basically shuts down. Okay, that's a huge issue within the community voluntary sector. And I'll give an example of it. If you've got a project that you want to deliver, so let's say it's a project for older people in your community. Let's say, for example, Meals on Wheels, right? And you're getting a pilot project to get this project off the ground. So you're applying for funding to purchase the equipment, to get the kitchen up and running, to buy in initial materials and stock or whatever it might be. And now you're in a position where you can offer Meals on Wheels in your local community to people who can't afford and are struggling to feed themselves, basically, right? So what you're looking at doing is you have this maybe funding for maybe 2 years, okay? And within the 2 years, everything's going fantastic. You're doing really, really well. People are really happy with the service. There's huge impact locally in terms of people's well-being. And then at the end of the 2 years, the funding stream that you're getting has stopped because the program's come to an end. And you're okay, we've put no other solution in place here, or no other method of getting in funds. Now we've got a situation where we can't fundraise because we got too much money to fundraise, and that's too late, and we've no plan B, and we no longer can fund this project. Now you're going back out to the community and you're saying to them, we can no longer deliver the service anymore, and we're stopping it. Okay. So the people that were kind of at a level like this all along, their expectations went up to here. And now you cut the funding because funding was cut from you, and you've no alternative option of funding it. You've now brought them not down to where they were at before, but down below it, because now they were expecting this, they were getting it every week, they were relying on it, and now it's gone. So with pilot funding, and pilot grant, pilot projects, you have to show, and they ask for this in the application form, how are you going to sustain this project after the 2 year period or 1 year period, or whatever it might be. Okay, you have to show a project and sustainability plan in place. If you're not able to sustain it, and there's no way you can sustain it after the pilot, I would question starting it in the first place. Okay, it's different if you're buying in things like you're getting funding to buy in equipment or build an extension, because that's fine, because once it's done, it's done. Okay, there will be kind of operational funding afterwards. But let's say you're getting a grant for 2 years to employ a coordinator to coordinate a project, and in 2 years' time, that funding for that coordinator was gone. and there was no additional funding brought in to pay the salary, that person's salary can't be paid anymore. That project now stops because the coordinator's position is not funded anymore. So just be careful if you're taking on grants that are pilot grants, one-off funding for projects, okay? And then look at, can you use any sort of in-kind support or voluntary support or voluntary labor as matching funds towards the cost of the project, okay? You'd also look in terms of rather than applying for grant, can we just basically get someone to do this for free on a voluntary basis for us? Okay, so rather than trying to find a grant to do, let's say, to paint the center, the community center, or paint whatever, or put up, signage, whatever it might be, can we get someone locally to do this for us for free, and therefore we don't have to apply for any grant because we're getting done for free? Or can we use things like, say, the value of the site or the value of the property that we have as matching funds towards the grant we're applying for? So this is why we kind of spend a bit of time looking at what your costs are, what you need money for. Is a grant the right approach for this, and is a grant a sustainable way of doing it? Because grants, primarily are kind of to kickstart something. They're not there to fund something long term, because it's not sustainable. Because all it takes is a government department to decide on, we're going to cut this grant to, by 20-30%, or we're going to scrap it and we're going to maybe move it off somewhere else. Then you've got a situation where your main source of funding is now gone. So just be very careful with grant support. So again, like capital projects, you've got construction projects. You want grants for a grant for construction professional fees towards like drawings, costings, planning fees, and then you need like funding for the fit out costs, construction costs, fit out costs. So what we work on is applications where we identify what funding we require to cover all these costs, and then we go off and try to find the funding for these projects and how much they can get. And it might be done on a phased basis. So a lot of projects we work on are phased projects because you can't get all the money in up front, or the project is so big that there's no way they're going to be grant dated in one go. So you might split the project into maybe three or four phases. Typically, example that would be a sports club, like a GA club, where they might have a development plan for the club over 5 years, which would include, pitch repair, pitch maintenance, pitch upgrades, flood lighting, ball nets, dressing rooms, car parking facilities, fencing, perimeter walking tracks. All these things can't be done in one go because of the cost of it. So they put a place in over 5 years, what they're going to do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then look for funding support, grant support to fund those elements of the projects. Okay, again, the source of funding we covered in the financial workshop before Christmas. Just going through them very quickly. So the options for funds for community volunteer organizations are fee income. So money you're charging for, fees you're charging for service you're providing, products you're providing, facilities you're providing, membership fees, things like that. One-off grants and core grants, which we're covering today. One-off grants are a grant, for like COVID grants that were there the last 2 years, one-off, kind of help you with getting PPE equipment in, or getting in IT equipment, or helping you, make your workplaces more safe. Core grants are like HSC, Section 38, Section 39 funding, community services program funding from PUBL, TUSLA funding, that are core funding organizations delivering services on their behalf, and their annual funding schemes. Fundraising, online fundraising, which we're going to talk about on Thursday, which is, what we're all getting used to now over the last 2 years when we were online doing everything, and including a fundraising activity. Sponsors, partners, donors, philanthropy. Again, these are all options in getting finance in. In looking at social loans, and social loans are important from a grant perspective, because with a lot of grants, especially the higher capital grants that you're applying for, you would need an element of loan finance. And you need loan finance for two things. One, you need what's called bridging finance. So bridging loan is where, with any grant you get, you will have to spend the money first and you draw down the grant afterwards. So you never get a grant payment up front. You have to go out there, spend the money. So if you're getting a grant to buy IT equipment for your office or center, and the grant is worth €5,000, you have to spend the €5,000 first. Okay, so you go off, you spend the money, you get your invoices and your receipts from your suppliers. You then do up a report on the actual money that was spent. You say, okay, we spent €5,000. Here's our receipts. Here's our invoices. Here's our bank statement showing the money going out of our account. There's the equipment in the office. Here's the insurance insuring the equipment. Then you draw it on the grant. So that €5,000 has to come from somewhere initially. So what some groups do is they borrow that €5,000 as a bridging loan. They spend the money, draw it on the grant, and then pay off the loan. Okay. In some cases, then for the larger capital funding, you have to come up with a percentage of the funds yourself. So with leader funding, you would have to come up with, say, 25% of the funds. If it's a capital project, so if you're doing a building project or buying equipment or whatever, you can apply for 75% of the cost, and you have to come up with 25% yourself. That 25% can be in the form of a loan. So now you're going to a bank and saying, look, I need to borrow 100% of this money first. I'll be clearing 75% of it once the grant comes in, and I want to convert that loan, the 25% of the loan that's left, into a term loan over 5 years or whatever it might be. Okay, so you might have a matching fund requirement there, and that matching funds might be through a term loan over a number of years. So there's you can go to the commercial banks, IB, Bank of Ireland, the rest of Ulster Bank, the credit union you can go to as well, or you can go to, which most groups do, is they look at social finance like Cancredo and Community Finance Ireland, the two social banks in Ireland, and they specifically fund only not-for-profit organisations. Okay, so they will look at the social merits of your project as well as the income repayment capacity of the organisation as well. And both these organisations have specific loans for matching funds for leader projects, for sports capital projects, etc. So they're open to looking at bridging finance, and they're open to looking at longer term loans and mortgages as well. If you're looking at commercial mortgages for properties, for example, if you're looking at investing in your own properties, community centres, renovations to old buildings in the town, things like that. And then in-kind contributions as well, we would factor in funds, and that would be labour costs, voluntary labour, materials being donated to a project, that could be building materials, or could be supplies, and then things like equipment that would be donated to a project as well. Put a value on all those, because again, they can be used as against your matching funds. So you can put in the value of these things as matching funding towards most grants, not all grants, but most grants. Okay, so grant aid, which we're going to be focused on this morning. So I said the specific grant aid, which is for one-off projects. There's the Law Pro ones there. That was a current one that we looked at there a few weeks ago for another project, which is Community Waters Fund, which is for rivers trusts and projects like that to look for funding for works to their rivers and waterways. You've got the Community Activities Fund, which is coming up at the moment, which is out there. And there's a number of grants that are currently live that are going to be accepting applications. They're all one-off type projects. Over the last 2 years, there's been basically a lot of grants that were COVID related, which were one-off funds. So a lot of organizations got a lot of funding in the last 2 years because there was a lot of projects, or a lot of grant supports out there. As the government recognised, obviously, that not only do we need to kind of, prop up the private sector in terms of PUP payments and supports for employees and things like that, and supports for businesses, they also realize we need to support the not-for-profit sector that are completely impacted by this as well, because they also have their workplaces, but also they have issues in relation to funding and fundraising. So there was a lot of funds made available over the last 2 years that were one-off funding relating to COVID. Then you have annual grants, as I said, HSE grants, community voluntary support grants, CSP grants, TUSLA grants. They're all annual grants that organizations that are in receipt of those have to would have service level agreements in place with those funders, and every year they would have to do reporting, and every year they would have to submit things like business plans or action plans to look at what they're going to do in the following year to secure those funds. So they're annual grants, but they're not automatic. They have to be applied for, and they are based on a level of service and service level agreements with those organizations. So typically you'd have disability services across the country that would do work on behalf of the HSE. So they're contracted by the HSE to provide services at local level. So organizations like St. John of God's, for example, the Brothers of Charity, Enable Ireland, they would all be funded by the HSE, and they're contracted to provide services on their behalf within local communities. They're all funded annually on the back of service level agreements. You have CSP funding, which is basically funding under PUBL, which is funding for social enterprises, and it's an employment support, and it's a subsidy towards the cost of your wages to cover the cost of your manager and your staff working in these programs. That's under review, and we're waiting on what the next social enterprise type program will be and the funding model that will be out there for that, and hopefully that will be happening sometime soon. So if you're eligible for an annual grant, or you feel that your organization could apply for an annual grant or a core funding from either HSE or CSP or one of these, you could look at a situation then where, if you are eligible for it, you could look at applying. I'm not saying it's something you should definitely do. It's something you should explore if you're eligible for it. And what we normally would do is we would sit down with the management in the various different departments, whether it be the HSC or whether it be in Pobble. We would outline in terms of what the project is all about, and they would give us a steer in terms of, yes, this is something we can support, or something we can't, or something we can look at. And they would then advise on the application process. And you go through a lot of hurdles to get to the point where they agree that your organization is an organization you can work with, and then you go through the whole application stage and agreement stage with them. Some organizations don't like going on that route because they feel they're tied to that, if it's HSC, they feel that they have to do everything HSC want. Absolutely you have to, because you could agreement with them. But it doesn't mean you can't do any other thing either. So with your organizations, you're operating the same way as my company operates. You're independent, you can do what you want to do. So if you've got grant aid for specific projects, yes, you have to do exactly what that grant is for. So you can't use the grant aid. If you get a grant to build an extension, you can't go off and buy a bus with it because it was for an extension. So you have to do exactly what the grant is for. But that doesn't mean you can't go off and get a grant to buy a bus from somewhere else. You can do whatever you want with the other funding you have. All you got to do is you got to show that how you spent their money in the right way, and it was done in the way you said you want to do it. They don't really care about the other funds you have once you're spending your money that they've given you in the correct way. So a lot of groups think that if I kind of hitch my wagon to one organization, one government department, am I kind of tied to what they want? Absolutely, for that purpose, but you can do whatever you want to do outside of that. Okay, and that's very important because you can mix match your grants, you can mix match your support, and you can structure your organization different ways that you can maximize the amount of grants to come in. So there's lots of ways around that. Don't ever feel you're going to be tied. If you get a grant from one organization, you're tied to them. You are for that purpose, but not for everything else. Okay, so that's important to understand. Some groups, they don't like being tied to any one organization. That's fine. I'd be encouraging, if you can get core funding from any department, I'd certainly be investigating as much as you possibly can to see, can you get that funding in place, because it is annual. So the basic steps that we will look at with any grant aid, whether it be one-off funding or longer term funding: research what grants are available for your type of project. If you're not sure what grants are available, I'll be talking about where to get the source information and grants in a few minutes. But if you're not really sure what you can get for your type of project, the key thing, and this is really important, there's thousands, hundreds and thousands of organizations out there across the country that are doing what you're doing, okay? That'll start the projects that you're starting, have done them successfully, okay? What we do is if someone comes to me and says, Tom, we want to do a project in our community and we want help with it in terms of how do we get it off the ground, how do we fund it? I don't have this crystal ball in the office that tells me where funding is available or how to get it or where to go. I go online, Google the projects that you're talking about and see if there's projects like it across the country. And if there is, I contact all of them and say, hi, how are you doing? Tom O'Leary here, calling from Kerry. We're working on a fantastic project down in Kerry, very similar to your project that you did above in Donegal or Galway or wherever it might be. Well done in your project. It was really, really good. Tell us how you did it. Tell us how you got off the ground. Tell us how you funded it. Okay. 9 times out of 10, they'll tell me, because there's no competition. It's not like I'm calling another training consultancy company asking for their magic formula. I'm bringing a not-for-profit organization, asking them how they did it. And communities are very proud about projects they've done. They love talking about their successful projects. The first thing we normally get is, Tom, tell me what group it is. We'd delight to have them come up and meet us, and we'll show them around and show them what we did. And that's what you do. So you look at what other groups have done, how they got it funded. Because if they've got funding, there's precedent set then that those types of projects will be funded, and you can go down the same route and looking for similar funding to it. So you could be kind of banging your head against the wall thinking, how do I do this? How do I do it? Don't try and reinvent the wheel. The wheel has already been invented somewhere else. Go and talk to them about how you can, create your own wheel and tweak it slightly to suit the local situation in your communities. Okay. The next thing is once you got information about the grants and where they're available and what grants are available for your project and what, when they're open for applications, know the deadlines. Okay, know when the deadline, when they're open, know when the deadline is for the application to be submitted. Okay. Sounds like a fairly common sense thing, and something that, of course, that'd be first thing you look at. The amount of people that don't look at the deadlines, and they call, like I get phone calls saying, Tom, how are things going on? We saw a grant that's available there. Can you do the application first? I'm like, well, do you realize that the application deadline is tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock? And they're like, oh, is it that? I thought it was next week. And sure, tomorrow evening 5 o'clock, it isn't going to happen. They might get it done, but I'm not going to be doing it for them within a day. So again, just look at the deadlines. Mark the deadline down in a diary, put it on your phone, put it on your Google Calendar, put it on a wall in your office. If you have an office, if you're working from home, put it on a wall in the home, put it on your fridge, do whatever you can do, put in reminders on your phone, but make sure you're aware of that deadline and make sure you start working well before the deadline on getting the grant ready. Look at the aims of the grant and what other groups have been awarded. So when a government department or local authority or public, whoever launches a grant and they open up for applications, they normally provide a lot of details around criteria, the aims and objectives of the grant, and they normally put a link to previous awardees of the grant as well. So you can see, is there any organizations out there previously that got funded that are similar to us or doing something similar to us? Okay, look at the aims of the grant and do they match what you're doing? If they don't match what you're doing, then don't apply for it. Okay, so if you find that because the granting, okay, well, we can do this, but if it's not needed and it's something you don't do in the past or you haven't done in the past or you don't really want to do, why would you go off and apply for it in that case? It's like someone looking for a job and they have a business degree and they're going looking for, they see a job come up for a mechanical engineer and they say, oh, it's a job anyway, so I'll go for it. It's a waste of time. You're not going to be eligible for it. So have the consultation done, and have the needs analysis done. Okay. In other words, have your project identified. You have to show what the rationale is for this project. In other words, if you came to me, let's say I won the lotto last week, 90 million euros, and I decided to set up a fund, okay, after I come back from Barbados and traveling the world, and I decided to set up a fund for community volunteer organizations. And you come to me and say, Tom, we're looking for 100,000 euros. Am I going to give you 100,000 euros and say, yeah, fantastic, you're a great group, I like what you're doing, here you go? No, I'm going to ask you, what is it for? And how you've identified the need for this project, and can you provide some rationale as to why you need this money? That's what I'll be asking for. That's what funders ask for, is they ask for, why should we give you this money as opposed to a group in South Kerry, West Kerry, North Kerry, East Kerry, or above in Donegal or Galway or Sligo or Dublin or wherever it might be, okay? You have to prove to them, we've identified this project based on consultation, there's a need for it, we've proven the need for it, and if you give us the money, we'll have this huge impact in our local community. That has to be provided. If you don't have it, I'll be questioning why you're going for this fund in the first place. Have you all the necessary documentation, which I'll be covering later on this morning in the workshop, the documentation that's required to be submitted with the application. If it's not on file, you don't have easy access to it, that's an issue because you mightn't have it on time. You might have the documentation at all. It might even exist in your organization. So they might be looking for policies, policy documents around things like health and safety, equality, employment law, your financial policy procedures, and you might have those things at all on file because you don't have them, and now you got a problem because they don't exist. Your solicitors or your accountants might have your company details and on file somewhere, anything, but I know they have them, and you call your accountant, and the accountant's up to their eyes with work, and they're like, oh yeah, I'll get it done. I'll email it up to you tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, you don't see it. Thursday comes, you don't see it. Friday comes, you don't see it. Next thing you're like an hour before the deadline, and you're driving to the sisters looking for the bloody documentation of them. Have everything that you need for any application sitting on file in your office if you have an office, or sitting wherever you're working from if you're a volunteer. I always recommend people to have a generic application complete. If you've already done an application for funding in the past, use that. If it's successful, use that as a template. 70% of application forms are the same information you use for every application. Things like your organization structure, your addresses, your air codes, your company numbers, your contact details, your organizational chart, the service you provide. They're all standard. They're not going to change every single year. So it's like your CV, your resume for yourself. 90% of that stays the same for every single job you apply for. All it changes is some of the wording you change to suit the job application. Okay, so with a grant application, if you do grant application this month for a specific project, the majority of information on that grant application will be the same information you'll be putting in the next grant application. So keep a copy of it as a template. If you have never applied for a grant before, I would, and most groups say, why would I bother doing this if I'm not going to be applying for grants? But you will be applying for grants at some stage. I would say just do a generic application. Have one ready, kind of one we made earlier type thing. You see there in the cookery shows, this one we prepared earlier. Have one ready to go because it'll save you time and instead you're all just rushing around getting stuff ready when you need to submit the application. And obviously the last step is the most important step. Make sure you complete the application form properly. You provide all the supporting documentation and technical documentation that they require. If you're asked for X, Y, and Z, you provide X, Y, and Z, unless you can give a reason as to why X, Y, and Z is not applicable to you, or you don't have it. Okay. As I'll be talking about on the workshop on online applications, the majority of applications now are going online. There will come a day when all applications will be online and there'll be no paper-based applications. That's good from the point of view that it kind of simplifies the application process, because you don't look for as much information with an online application. But it also means that there's very little room for error. So if you make a mistake in that application process, it will deem your application void. The deadlines are very strict because it's on a portal. That portal reaches the deadline time of, say, 5 p.m. Friday evening. It closes down. That portal is not available after that, so you can't get the application afterwards. The days of kind of thinking, bringing someone in the local authority saying, geez, I missed the deadline, but I'll drive down now real fast with the application form that is printed off. Can I meet you outside the gate at 6:30 and just slot it in and stamp it as received at 5 o'clock? Those days are kind of gone. So when it's online, there's no wiggle room to make mistakes. So what we encourage you to do, this is very, very simple. It's not high tech. I'm not a great believer of using kind of software programs or project management programs. Get your Excel spreadsheet, get a wall chart, get a diary, get something you can actually do, or just take this template that I have in front of you, draw with a ruler and marker on a piece of paper, but get this somewhere within your organization. So if you've an administrator, if you've got a treasurer, whoever's responsible for getting money in the door, use this template. So what we try to encourage groups to do is put down the name of the grant that they're going to be applying for. Now, some grants come up every single year. So, like your community services fund program, your leader funding would be coming up again. Your sports capital funding for your sports organization, your town and village renewal scheme funding. All these funds kind of an annual funding that come up every year. They're announced every year. There used to be a book years ago called the Cafe Handbook. Back when I started working in the local development sector back in 1998, there was a book called Cafe Handbook, and that was basically kind of like your Bible for the sector, and it had all the lists of all the sources of funding, everything, and all the deadlines and dates, and that became kind of irrelevant because government departments changed. They didn't have set deadlines for grants. So you can never say that I know that this grant will be available in April or March, because they changed it around, because it gets political. So they'll, government departments and politicians and ministers will use grant aid, because this grant aid is good news stories to bring to their communities. So if you find that, like, when things are kind of going pretty bad negatively for governments, they normally introduce programs of funding, and they'll withhold funding programs until they kind of want to go out there with the good news. So you can't really say for certain when that deadline is going to be. You just got to keep an eye out for when the deadlines are there. So we put in the name of the grant, the source of the grant, so what the organization, government department, local authority, whatever it might be, is giving the grant. The contact name of the person or department you're going to be dealing with, and their email. Hugely important, because you will be asking them for information, for further information in certain cases. Even if you don't need further information, always email them anyway and build that relationship with the person within the department. So, like, I normally would send an email, kind of like kind of asking maybe a question that I know the answer to anyway, and say, look, hi, how are you? We're putting together an application for a fund here, a project here in Tralee or whatever it might be. Just 2 questions we have, just to make sure we're okay with what we're doing. And they come back and they reply, and you thank them for the reply, and you kind of build this up kind of like backwards and forwards, with them, because you want that contact when first of all, if you get turned down for the grant, you can go back and ask for some feedback. Secondly, if you get awarded the grant, you email them and thank them for their support and help with the application form. And thirdly, you want to get on their email list, so when they announce the application next year, you're on their mailing list, because you're on their radar as such. So we get loads of emails in from various different departments from people, because we basically kept in touch with them. Not saying you become their buddy and stalk them or anything like that. We're not emailing every 5 seconds, but build some sort of contact. You got a kind of an email trail back and forth from the department. Put down what project you're going to be applying for. So you might have multiple projects that you're running, and you start identifying, okay, at your board meetings or at your committee meetings, okay, we want to do X, Y, and Z. where should we go for this funding? We want to do, A, B, and C. Where should we go for this funding? So we would have projects we work on that would have a cocktail of funds, multiple funding sources for all the various different projects. And they try to identify what fund would be most suitable for that project. Okay. So with COVID, as I said, there was a load of grants for COVID. And we had a few organizations who applied for funding for things like IT equipment, because people were working remotely. We were working with one disability organization, all their services that were in-house that were being provided for their clients now went on Zoom, but a lot of their clients didn't have access to tablets or laptops, so they secured funding for those tablets and laptops. And another organization we worked with who didn't need tablets and laptops for clients, they needed for their offices, and they managed to get in under the IT grant for that. They didn't necessarily need it, but the funding was available to it. So they used COVID and used the grant that was available to get in funding to buy equipment that they needed, but normally couldn't get it funded, if that makes sense. So they listed what they needed and said, okay, where can we go for this? And they identified we can actually apply for this and get this funding for this equipment that we need for the office. We write in the application deadline. Okay, that's really important. So what the deadline date is, what is required. So in other words, we write in what information is required to be submitted with the application. So we have a list of all the things that we need. Okay. Then the grant preparation actions. In other words, what do we need to do to get this grant ready and ready for application? And then we assign people who are responsible for it, and we give them deadlines. So I give an example of this is where if we're working with, say, a soccer club on doing a sports capital application, and they come to me and say, Tom, we want you to prepare the application for me. I go through this with them. So I put down the application deadline is, let's say, the 1st of April, okay, as an example. And I put on, we need the following information from you. So I give them a list of all the things I need from the club, okay? And, I'll say then what they need to do to get that information if they don't have it ready. So, for example, if they need to get, planning permission, they need to engage with an architect to get the planning application at least applied for, so they have reference number. And then we put they would then nominate someone within the club that be responsible for getting that piece of information. And then I set them deadlines. So I'll say, Joe, I need this information by Friday week. Mary, I need this information by Thursday week, right? So then I'm putting pressure on to get the information back to me. So I have everything back in time to put the application in, okay? If you're doing this yourself and not using me to do an application for you, you'll be doing the exact same thing. You'll be delegating pieces of work to get everything ready for the deadline. Okay, so there's not one person responsible for it. So normally if it's a large grant application you're applying for, normally we can recommend you set up a committee, if you have numbers to do it, set up some sort of kind of project committee that will be responsible for putting this thing together. Okay, so it's a very simple way of managing the process of the grant. Now that might seem like an awful hard work to put into getting a fund. If it's a small grant worth like 1,500 euros, I wouldn't be going to this level of detail. But if you're talking about a grant that's worth 150,000 euros, I absolutely would be putting an awful lot of effort into it. Think about the amount of fundraising you would have to do to raise, say, 100,000 euros. Massive amount of work. People think, well, it's not a lot of work putting a grant application together. It's a fraction of the work you put together to get, it's a fraction amount of work you would do compared to fundraising to get that level of funding. Okay, the level and quality of the applications have to be at a level now where they're absolutely exceptional because there's so much competition for funding. And people are getting better and better at writing applications. You have to have the standard that's going to get you above the minimum amount of marks even to be accepted or be even reviewed and be assessed. So you do need to put the work in. Small bit of organization, small bit of planning is all that's required to make sure you have everything in place and ready for the time for the deadline. And that's really important because, as I said, a lot of people just think they focus on writing the application form, they forget about all the other stuff, and they miss deadlines because they don't have the supporting documentation required. So where do I get all of my information from on grants? How do I know what's coming up? How do I know what deadlines are out there? How do I know what funds are available? There's three main sources that we look at. In Kerry, we look at Kerry PPN. And I'm not saying this now because Caroline and Naim are on the Zoom with us, but I've been working with Kerry PPN on projects and training and everything else for many years, and prior to that, the Community Voluntary Forum. And in fairness to Kerry's PPN will be a lot stronger. We do a lot of work in Limerick and Cork and other places, and they won't have the same level of support from the PPNs in those counties. And one thing the Kerry PPN does, and you see with the newsletters you receive, is that they update the newsletter regularly, and they put information up on what grants are coming up in that month or within in that time period, so you have access to it. Okay, so it's a free source of information that you should be tapping into and keep an eye on regularly to see is anything coming up that's relevant to us. You've got Funding Point, which is part of the wheel, and Funding Point is a paid subscription service. It's about $120 for the year, so it's not going to break the bank. And that provides you with access to an online database of all the grants that are coming up. So they update that regularly. So whenever time a grant has been announced, they put up on their system and they say this grant is available, and they give the deadlines. And that's for every sort of grant. So some grants won't be relevant at all. They might be very specifically relating to a local authority area. So they might be relating to Galway, Cork, Limerick, Dublin. They might be very specifically for a very specific type of projects. It could be like, say, youth projects, justice projects, disability projects, ex-prisoners, could be refugee, asylum seekers type project. It could be very specific that's not related to you. So you go through it all and you pick out what's relevant to you and what's not relevant to you. Okay, and that's updated regularly. That has links to, has the deadline, and also has links to the grant itself and the information about the grant. So it's a very good source as well. Activelink.ie, they've got a very good website as well, similar to Funding Point. It's free, and again, that has information on all the funding opportunities coming up in that particular time. I've just stepped in this one here from a previous one, which was anyone that's involved in, say, climate action type projects or environmental projects. The Caro website, caro.ie, has a very, very good, even if it's not relating to the environmental projects, it's a very good database of grants that are coming up and resources that are coming up for projects. So a lot of groups will be working on environmental projects, maybe not as their core business, but certainly part of it. And then you got groups that are primarily focused on environmental projects within their local communities. So it's a reason I put in there. It's a very good resource. It's got a very good resource hub on their website with all the information on all the various different grants that are available. It's also got a very good resource if you're looking at European funding. So EU funding, again, can be fairly complex, but it's got good links to EU funding opportunities as well. Also get on government departments email list. So look at the government departments that are relevant to you. So what government department will be relevant to you and the work you do. Now, you might be relevant to a number of different departments, and you contact their press office and you get on their email list. So because the grants are public funds, they have to announce them publicly. They have to make them available for everyone, and they have to announce them. So and they're not going to do a lot of the high publicity announcements, because they're going to try to keep it under the carpet. But it's not, unless you're looking for it, it's not going to find them. So if a department, say the minister launches the Community Activity Fund for 2022, there's going to be a press release on that that's going to be issued to all the papers. Okay, get on the email list. You get a copy of that press release as well sent to you. Okay, it'll also be on these other sites. But again, it's just, in other words, what you want is getting 3 or 4 sources of information coming into your email regularly, telling you what grants are coming up. Okay, what we normally recommend is assign someone within your organization to do that, maybe once a week. Put in the diary that Friday morning from 9:30 to 10 o'clock, I'm going to do a quick scan of all my sources and see what's out there that's relevant to me. Okay, and do it every week, because you might say, but sure, if I do it every week, nothing's relevant to me, and I forget about it. The one week you forget to do it, you probably miss a deadline. It wouldn't take half an hour, take 10 minutes to do it. So again, have someone person responsible. That person who's responsible will normally come back into the committee or to the board and say, look, I spotted this application out there, funding's opened up for this. Is this something we should go for or not go for? And then you go through the criteria to see if it's relevant to you or not relevant to you. Very often, what I'll do is, if I see grant opportunity coming up and I know there's organizations I've worked with in the past out there, I'll just drop an email and say, you might be aware of this. If you're not aware of it, have a look at it. It might be something you're interested in doing. Okay, so I'll just bang it off to people that I think that would be relevant for. But don't, I'm saying, people, don't wait for me to do it, because I mightn't spot it either. So normally what I do is, if I'm working on a specific project for a group, I will keep an eye on these things for funding that's relevant to those. So again, this is where I get my information from, and it's available to all of you. There's no kind of secret system out there. This is all publicly available to you online. This is the website. So Active Links website, you can see very simple database, the title of the grant, the region that it's relevant to, the listed deadline, and category. So they've split it on. You can actually search for things as well, region, categories, and you can filter it. Then the funding point, you click on the funding point opportunities here. It brings up a database very similar to this, with a list of all the grants and the deadlines, okay? So again, you might miss some deadlines, or some things might be way down the line. It might be like July, June, July, or something like that. Again, if they're relevant to you, I will mark them in the diary now so that you're ready for them, because you'll forget about them. You might say, I'll go back to that now in May, and you forget completely about it. So mark it in. Again, just invest in the wall chart for if you have an office, to put them on the wall and put it in, red marker, deadline for a grant, and then put a big line backwards. I'm not off camera doing this, but you put a big line backwards to the date you start work on it. Okay, so it's all very visual. Because look, we're all human. We will say, like everything else, I'll get to that now next week, and you forget completely about it. And next thing you realize, Jesus, the deadline's probably next week, and you look back and you missed the deadline. And we've all been there and missed deadlines because of it. So yeah, you got Google Calendar or your Outlook calendar, or I like wall charts because you're looking at them the whole time. Okay, sample grants, they're out there. That kind of come up regularly every year. Leader funding, at the moment, we're kind of in a transition phase with Leader. Their program finished at the end of 2020. So the last year and this year is probably called transition period. They have some funds available, not that much though, if they have any left at all. So the two main LDCs, local development companies in Kerry, are South Kerry Development Partnership, and you've Northeast West Kerry Development. IRD do Hallow cover parts of East Kerry as well, but the two main ones are SKDP and NEWKD. They'll fund feasibility studies up to €25,000. The rate is 90%. That's through feasibility studies, feasibility analysis, analysis and development grants, they call them. That will cover things like, say, consultancy fees, architect surveys, engineer surveys, architects drawings, concept drawings, costings, that sort of thing. Research, that kind of area. They won't cover things like planning fees or tendering processes. That won't be covered by them, but pretty much everything else will be up to €25,000. 75% of capital grants up to €250,000. So the next Leader program, we're presuming, will kick in 2023, so next year. And at that point, they'll have a brand new, new budget starting off from scratch. So they'll have a lot of money at that point, and they will be able to fund up to €250,000 based on previous programs. So they'll have serious money to play with to give out at the start of the program. Normally towards the end of the program, their budgets are kind of gone because they're at the end of the program. So trying to aim for, if you are looking at project development, kind of aim for next year as being kind of a good time to kickstart stuff, because there will be a new program in place, there will be money in place. Town and Village Renewal Scheme is, so a lot of these funds are managed through and administered through the local authority, Kerry County Council in this case. It's Town and Village Renewal Funding. Again, a lot of rural communities would benefit from this a lot. Again, that's funds of between 20,000 and 100,000 euros. Outdoor Recreation Infrastructure Scheme, again, Kerry County Council manage that locally. Again, small scale projects up to 20,000 euros, medium scale projects up to 200,000 euros, large scale projects between 200 and 500,000 euros. All the funding that goes towards greenways and that sort of infrastructural projects come out of the scheme. Okay, we've done a few applications with groups where they've done recreational walks, recreational parks, biodiversity projects, greenways, blueways type projects where they would get funding from that. The council will also put in their own applications for their own projects. So, they will be looking at their own projects too that they're working on directly themselves, they're responsible for, but they'll also support local community groups. The big ones then, in terms of capital projects, you've got the Rural Regeneration Development Fund, or RDF, and the Urban Regeneration Development Fund, or URDF. So URDF would be relating to Tralee, and RDF then would be relating to any towns less than 10,000 people. Okay, they have two categories of funds. Category 2 is pre-development stage, so when you're getting your projects to be shovel ready. So if you're looking at doing a building, community centre, enterprise centre, food hub, something like that, you're looking at category 2 is where you're looking at the whole planning, design, getting the project where it's got planning permission and is ready to apply for full funding. And then category 1 is where you got your planning permission in place, you're ready to start the project, and you're applying for your capital funding. They're big money, so it's for the type of projects are over 500,000. So it's not for small projects, for large scale capital projects, and there can be serious money involved in this scheme. The deadline for the RDF is the end of April for category 1. So unless you've got planning permission ready for a project, you won't be in a position to apply for that. We're working on 2 at the moment, that hopefully will be in position by the end of April to be ready. Community Enhancement Programme, again, funded by Kerry County Council, again, covering community amenities and facilities, things like playgrounds. Thai towns groups apply for this grant a lot, goes towards work in terms of infrastructure work within the community. Community support funds, similar as well to the Community Enhancement Programme. That's to fund small scale community projects, maybe small upgrades, facilities, equipment, things like that. CLAR Programme for projects based in CLAR areas. So CLAR is areas that are considered some way disadvantaged. Pretty much all of Kerry is CLAR. There's certain areas are not covered under CLAR, but a lot of areas are. And they've got, again, CLAR funding for those areas. Pubble then, if you go into Pubble's website, they manage a load of programs for government. So they have a different type of funding programs that are very specific for specific type projects, and they're kind of broader projects that are open then for other groups as well. Community Foundation, again, they have a range of grants. Again, if you go into the website, has a list of grants that are open and grants that are closed. Okay, so similar to your funding sources, keep an eye on what they've got coming on. Again, get on their mailing list. So when they open a fund, they'll email you saying this fund is now open. Rethink Ireland, again, is another source of funding. Look at the grants they have. Again, they're very specific to specific areas. Similar to Community Foundation, they have a list of grants that are open and grants that are closed. Okay. Both these might have grants that are relevant to you, but keep an eye on them anyway, because you never know. I'd always, you might think, well, this source is irrelevant to my projects, but you might change what you're doing within your community or within your organization that might think, well, actually, I can apply for this now because this is something we want to do. We didn't do it before, but we want to do it now, and we know it might be eligible under these things. Okay, so there's the sample of them. Again, what we normally do is we take the deadlines. We look at the criteria, look at the aims of the project, and we kind of work from there, then putting the application together. There is one coming up at the moment. Now we're waiting for the council to give us kind of an idea in terms of when the deadline will be. And this was just launched just before Christmas. Some local authorities have already gone through the application stage, and they've come up to the deadlines are at the end of January. But it is up to each local authority. Each local authority got an allocation of funds, and it's up to the local authority themselves to administer that project or that grant within their own local area. And it's based to provide small grants for community groups impacted by the pandemic. So things like community centres, men's sheds, women's sheds, parish halls, youth centres. The key thing with them is that it's going to be supporting groups that are kind of focused on the policies under our rural future. And this is something we're talking about later on this morning. And this is the key. With funding, whatever funding is available nationally or locally or regionally, a government department will not open up a fund and give funding for projects unless it's linked to their policies. Okay, so you need to know what their policies are, first of all. And their policies are their rural development policies, for example, are outlined in our rural future strategic document they launched there last year, and obviously the National Development Plan. That's where the policies are outlined in terms of what they're looking to do and what they're hoping to do over the next number of years, right? So what you need to make sure is that your project mirrors that policy. So if they're looking to, improve rural regeneration by focusing on the renovation of derelict buildings in village centres, for example, as accommodation or as community facilities or as enterprise space, and you've got an ugly derelict building in the middle of the village that you want to do something with, now thinking, okay, well, the policy is to renovate these things. We need to come up with a plan for this building, to do something with it, and then go back to the government and say, look, you wanted to just do X, Y, and Z. We're doing X, Y, and Z for you. Give us money to do it. It links back to your policy. Okay, so anyone who's applying for the Community Activities Fund must make sure that their projects are some way linked to the objectives under our rural future. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes, because that's really important in giving you the advantage over other groups in terms of putting your best case forward to look for that funding. This will be administered through Kerry County Council. It is a new one, and it is the limits are kind of vague because different local authorities have different limits on it. I think Kerry got, I'm not sure exact number, but I think about 300,000 plus, between 300,000 and 400,000 euros, I think, allocated to them. So there is money out there. So you won't be going in looking at, they're not going to fund 3 projects at 100 grand each sort of thing. So it's going to be divvied out across the county. So don't go in with some mad kind of project. But make sure that you can show that how you're impacted by the pandemic, how this project and this funding will support you, and how it links in with national policy in terms of rural policy. Okay, so basically the type of projects that the Community Activity Fund would support. Again, development and renovation of community centres. So there's lots of community buildings out there that need money big time. Community amenities, any like youth club or facilities, development of sports and recreation facilities, improving town parks, common areas, public realm improvements. So if you've got a village centre and works need to be done on, say, street furniture, lighting, improvements to footpaths, etc. Streetscapes, development of play recreation spaces, energy efficiency projects. So if you're looking, you got to say a building and it's not really energy efficient, you want to get maybe it insulated or properly, or get in LED lights and replace old lights, that sort of stuff we funded. Purchase of equipment, any adaptations to equipment needed as a result of COVID. So again, a lot of groups in centres we worked in have put in, additional office space, or they put up screens, or they put in, kind of breakout rooms just to kind of create more space within their centres. Maintenance of premises. They will, which is unusual, they will fund operational costs, or partly. So again, your utility bills, operating costs. So let's say, for example, you struggled big time last year in fundraising because of the pandemic, and you're struggling to meet bills, and you've got maybe rent that's due, or you've got bills that are due, and you're really struggling, that you can apply for some of this to cover that. Just beware though, it is only a band-aid, that you only literally put a band-aid over the cut. You need to be able to sustain those longer term. And that's going back to what I said earlier on. Getting the grant is brilliant, but if it just kind of like, covers that cost for a period of time, and you go back to your old ways and you don't do anything about fixing your cost structure or bringing in additional income in, you're only kind of kicking the can down the road, to be honest. Website maintenance, any cleaning, audit and accountancy fees. So in fairness, it's very, very, open, which is very unusual for any grant. It pretty much lets you kind of apply for anything really, which is great. So again, once we get word of when that's open, I'd be encouraging you all to be jumping on it once it's been announced by the council. So why are applications turned down? Just gonna check the chat here, just to make sure. Okay. Okay, I'll just cover those questions. I'm looking at here. In a few minutes, the questions came in there. Just go through this one really quickly first. The applications, why are they turned down? The most obvious one is usually the fund, not usually, always the fund is oversubscribed. So they might have to say, as in this situation, maybe 200,000 euros of a budget, and they get applications worth 1.5 million. There's not enough money to go around to everyone. A lot of groups apply for grants they're not eligible for. They just don't read the criteria, which is kind of crazy, to be honest, but a lot of groups do it. They submit applications for the sake of it. Deadlines, the application was received beyond the deadline. As I said, with online applications, that's no longer the case, because if you missed the deadline, you can't actually submit the application anyway, because you can't get into the system anymore. A poor application. I've seen some absolutely shocking applications in the last 2 years that have been funded. Crazy stuff. And that's just created a kind of, that's just, the standards have dropped because some of the COVID grants were easy to get, in fairness, and a lot of people just kind of rushed applications in. They got the funding and thought this is easy, and their standard law of applications are kind of reflective of that. Just because one grant is easy to get doesn't mean that the next grant you can just fire in anything and expect to get it. But I have seen really shocking applications going in, and I've seen really brilliant applications going in for other projects that were turned down. No consultation shown. You just hadn't proven to them that there was a need for this project, which, if you can't prove it, there probably was never a need for the project in the first place. Poor or no track record. Again, some organizations have no track record in managing public funds. They have no track record in managing projects. They're brand new and just haven't convinced the people assessing the application that you're capable of actually managing a project. Or you might have a bad track record and you're just flagged within the organization as an organization that's not really easy to work with because of just poor administration or difficulty in reporting, or have caused problems in the past. And look, we're all, people assessing these things are human. They're going to remember difficult clients that they had in the past. So they might say, look, but these guys were a nightmare to work with before. Are we happy to give them money again? No. Have they spent the money we gave them last time? No, we're not going to give them funding again. So it's very objective as well. or subjective as well, which is not a great thing because, that's why you never annoy people that assess applications or get on the wrong side of people in departments or local authorities, because they are the ones assessing your application. Missing support documentation is probably one most common one. So people just forget to put in a document, or they just don't have the document that's required. Again, no needs analysis is similar to what we set up here in terms of you haven't shown consultation, you haven't proven the need for the project. And then another big one is that the group just don't have the matching funds. If you're applying for 100,000 euros from Leader and you have 25,000 euros matching funds, and you're thinking, sure, by the time the grant comes on, we'll have it. You have to have matching funds in place at the time you apply for the grant. So it has to be in your account, sitting there in the bank statement, or you have to have a loan approval from the bank. Okay. So, and you might have those things in time. You might have the money in the account and you might have the loan approval in time. Therefore, you don't have matching funds in place at the time. Therefore, your application is deemed eligible. So they're usually the reasons that they're turned down. This one you can't do anything about. This one is unforgivable. This one is unforgivable. This one's unforgivable. This one, it's I suppose how much you've done. This one is if you're a brand new group, it's something you can't do anything about because you have no track record. If you're well established, it's up to you to make sure that you've got a good record and you've got a good reputation within the sector. This one's unforgivable. And the last one, this one might be out of control as well, because in fairness, some groups, the banks don't come back to them in time with the loan approvals and just mess them around a lot. That's why you to really start preparing well in advance of especially with the larger applications. Smaller ones, you only need half the much information, so it's not as bad. But certainly with the large capital grants, it isn't something you're going to do rush in last minute. Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions. Has anyone got questions maybe before we move on to the next part of this? No? You're okay? So the questions came in there was, who can give grant for feasibility studies? Yeah, it's Leader Funding, Leader Grants. Leader primarily will give feasibility funding. The rates are available 90%. Under the previous programs, we're presuming the next program will be similar. GoFundMe, are there any guidance we need to know? Yeah, I'm going to be covering that on the workshop on Thursday morning on the online fundraising. So we'll be talking about third-party sites like GoFundMe or mycharity.ie and all those, in terms of, are they better to go with them or you better do your own thing? How do we put on volunteer working hours? Yeah, if you're putting in volunteer hours as matching funds on your projects, depending on the grant that you're applying for, they would have very specific reporting requirements. So they will outline to you how you put that in. So Leader, for example, have things like timesheets. You got to put in a number of hours, the work you're doing, the qualifications they have, and also then in terms of when you're doing a drawdown, that has to be verified by someone. Okay, so you can't say, oh yeah, Tom O'Leary did 10 hours for us there, and Maria, and he didn't. You need to be able to prove that as well. So each funding organization have their own reporting requirements and their own specific ways of accounting for those voluntary hours. Okay, the same if you're putting, say, together in contribution in terms of the value of the site or property. They have very clear ways that has come from, has to be an independent auctioneer or has to match market value, whatever it might be. So there's no kind of one answer for that. It all depends on the grant organization, what way they want you to account for the volunteer hours. Okay, so the limits, then Conor Ayer's question, they're running through the details regarding, so the limits of funding. So you have the minimum funding, which basically means that, let's say, for example, you're getting Leader funding. You, over a 3-year period, it's I think it's 200,000 euros over a 3-year period. So if you say you have received a Leader grant of 150,000 euros in the past 2 years, let's say, right, and you're now applying for 80,000 euros off them, you're going to be at the limit where they're going to say, well, we can give you up to 50,000, but we can't give you beyond that because you're at the threshold. So there is de minimis. It's called de minimis funding. It's a European directive, and again, there's very clear rules and regulations around that with the various different funding departments. It really comes up in Leader funding a lot, where an organisation has received more than the threshold over the 3-year period, which means that they're now not eligible to apply for the grant. I'm not advising this because I'm not qualified to advise on it, but what I would suggest you do is talk to a solicitor or an accountant around if you have a situation where you maxed out on the amount of grant aid you can bring in over that 3-year period, there is an opportunity to look at the structure of your company. So what a lot of organizations do is they have maybe 2 companies operating. Okay, they're completely independent of each other. They might have the exact same directors on boards, but they're independent. They're separate legal entities, which allows them to apply for funds under different headings. So if one organization is maxed out and has reached their limit in terms of de minimis, the other company hasn't, so they go in and apply for something. An example of that would be we had an organization we worked with years ago that had a large community center, and they were applying for grants to renovate their dressing rooms that were part of their sports hall within the center. And they were also applying for, over the dressing rooms were meeting rooms, and they were applying for funding to renovate their dressing rooms. At that time, you couldn't apply for sports capital funding and leader funding for the same project or for the same space. So they had to pick one or the other. So what they did was they decided that the front part of the building would become a community center. They'd renovate their dressing rooms and convert them into meeting rooms, and they would build on brand new dressing rooms to the rear of the building, to the other side of the building, to the gable, and have that as their sports section. So they set up 2 separate projects within their center. So one was community based and one was sports based, and they were able to maximize grants then because we went after community grants and sports grants because there was 2 separate projects. Other projects then we worked in would have maybe 2 or 3 companies operating. So might have a holding company that would own a building, and another company might run a childcare, might run a daycare, or might run, or might rent the facility for say meat. So for example, an enterprise space. So there's kind of ways around it, but you need to talk to your solicitors or accountants about if you're putting in additional structures, company structures to maximize grant aid, how's that going to impact on you from your charity's perspective, from your accounting fees perspective, the administration bureaucracy involved. But it is a way around the de minimis, because and we might be careful that you're not actually applying for funding for the same project in different ways. So you can't get funding. You can't say, for example, here's my receipts and invoices for the project and draw down grant from one source and use the exact same receipts and invoices, draw down grant from another source. You've got to split your projects out and look at how it can fund these different ways, because you can't get something funded twice, if that makes sense. So again, it's always well to talk to the development officers within the leader companies or within the local authorities or within government departments and ask them to clarify the situation around de minimis funding. Okay, because again, your funding might be coming in from, say, the Exchequer funding, or it could be EU. So you got to see which is counted as part of the de minimis. Okay, because it does vary, and there is room to maneuver around it. It is there, but again, as I said, just always get clarification from the development officer to make sure that you can put in what you can and what you can't put in. Because otherwise, you could put something in and they'll come back after and say it's not eligible because you got over the threshold. Whereas if you did it in a different way, you might have got around that. I hope that answered the questions for you. Okay, any other question before we move on? No? Okay. Okay, so the next slide there is looking at the documentation required. Now, this varies from grant to grant. This is kind of is a list of everything you'd be looking for. You'd be asked for certain grants. Some of this information they will not look for at all, and some information won't be relevant to some of your projects, but I just mark them in anyway, just as an example. So if you're looking at a large-scale capital funding project, so a very large project which requires a lot of money, you're applying for a substantial grant, you need to back that up normally with a business plan or a strategic plan or a feasibility study. Okay, they won't just say, oh, sure, they're looking for $500,000. They put a good application together, but give it to them. You need to be able to back that up with some sort of an analysis. So we're doing one at the moment for projects above that loan. That's a €7.2 million project. It's for a digital hub and enterprise center. Obviously, a massive project. The first preliminary stage of that is they want a preliminary business case analysis done. So that's basically we're going to do building survey, design concepts, cost analysis on an indicative cost analysis basis, and then what we do is the business model, the revenue model, the funding model, and the impact analysis in terms of that. Does it deserve 7.2 million, and what's the return on the local economy from that? So that's a fairly very detailed an assessment. For smaller projects, they won't require that. But anything above €100,000, you'd want to be doing this yourselves anyway in terms of putting a proper plan in place to see is something we should be doing. So the plan then would contain the needs analysis, show why are you doing this in the first place? What's the rationale for it? Is there a need for it? Is there a sustainable need for it? Do people in our community want this? So in other words, that's where you've identified a gap. So if you might say we're doing another bit of work at the moment in a village here in Kerry, they have no meeting rooms at all for the community. So no place for people to meet, no place for older people to have a cup of coffee, to play bingo, no place for after schools. They have no building where you can actually have use as community. So they've identified a need for community building, and we're now working on that with them in terms of where can they put it, how much will it cost, etc. So they can very clearly say there's a need for it. What's their objectives? How does it tie in with their overall organizational objectives? And then this one is the big one, which I talk about, is the strategic context. How does it fit in with national policy, local policy, regional policy? Okay. The operational model, how it's going to operate. So if you're looking for big money to run a project, you got to show them how you're going to operate that project afterwards. Okay. So if you're looking for 7.2 million for a project, like lads above that loan, they need to be very clear. What's the organizational structure? How it's going to be run? What's company structure? The governance model? What's the staffing structure? What's the income levels coming in? All this kind of stuff, right? If it's a smaller project, again, you can say how are you going to manage it? How are you going to run it? Is it financially viable? Again, it's like any project or any business. If you start something, can we keep the show on the road here after we develop it? I think I always give the example of organizations, applying for grants for a bus, and they get a bus, but they get no money for a driver, they get no money for diesel, they get no money for maintenance. And now they're looking at the bus that's sitting in their yard, but they can't drive it because there's no one to drive it or can't keep it on the road. So you might say, well, we can get the grant for it, but it's not financially viable for us to have it long term. Or typically, groups building massive, sports halls, community facilities, and then realize in 3 years' time, oops, we need to upgrade the facility. We need to, keep the heat on longer than we thought. We need to, and now we're looking at, 100 grand a year overhead, and we're making 40 grand a year fees. Now we got a problem. Now they're all fundraising just to keep the lights on. Last people put in, euro coins into meters to keep the lights on. So you've got people playing basketball running off the court to put in a euro into the meter to keep the lights on for another 10 minutes. That's how to carry on. It was never financially viable, never had good model in place, but got funding for it. What's happening now is the government are looking more carefully at when they're giving grants out for large scale projects. They want to make sure that all this analysis is done. Unless you can prove that it's sustainable and you have a proven need for it, they just won't fund it. So they are looking for more of analysis on that. So if it's like €1,000, €2,000, you won't have to do all this. But if it's for larger scale projects, you should be doing this anyway, even if they weren't looking for it. This will determine where you need to go for funding. Annual reports. Again, if you don't have an annual report, you should have an annual report. If you don't have one, there's no reason why you shouldn't have one. That shows the funders your track record in terms of managing projects, getting projects off the ground over the last number of years. Okay, very important because you're showing this track record there. You're showing you're capable of spending money and managing public funds. Really, really important. Okay, your annual accounts they will look for. If you don't have your last set of accounts because your accountant hasn't finished yet, they will look for management accounts. So your most up-to-date accounts that shows income and expenditure. If you're a brand new group, you won't have annual accounts anyway because you only started, that's fine. But if you are established, they will look for probably maybe the last 2 years annual accounts. If you're not a company and you're just basically a constituted group operating under a constitution, you'd have your treasurer's report or your income and expenditure analysis that was done for last year. So simple money in, money out. Okay. They will look for bank statements as well. Your constitution or your members active association, they look for quotations. Again, that would depend on the project. So anything less than €5,000, typically we need 2 quotations. Anything between 5 and 25,000 euros, we'll look for 3 quotations, and they have to be proper quotations coming in signed by the person who's submitting the quote. A verbal quotation won't do. An email quotation will do, but you got to prove that the email came in and when it was received, has to be received by a certain deadline. Anything over 25,000 euros normally would have to go to full tender. So we need to go up on e-tenders, which is the government procurement system. And that means anyone from anywhere can tender for that piece of work. Now that can cause problems because you might have someone local that you want to do the work, but now you got to go to full tender. So that creates problems because now you get in, like, you got to assess all these tenders coming in, and you still want the local person to do it. So you got to see, how to make sure they get to do it in the end. So a lot of groups, what they'll do is they're trying to keep the projects below the limits to keep the tendering process down. But it is public funds. It is taxpayers' money, so they want transparency and accountability. So you got to make sure you fulfill the quotations requirements. Planning details. If you're doing building works, they look for planning details. Again, some funders, you have to have planning secured before you apply for the funds. Others, you have to have just the planning applied for, so you need to have a reference number from the planning department, so they can actually go into the planning department in that local authority area and confirm you actually have applied for planning. So if you've got a project that requires planning to be in place to apply for the grant and you don't have it in place, there's no point in spending time then working on an application, as you won't get assessed. Any technical documentation like drawings, plans, bill of quantities, pre-tender estimates from a quantity surveyor, any surveys are required. Again, they make it very clear in terms of what they need when you're applying. Proof of consultation normally will be your analysis or your business plan or a feasibility study. So you refer to that. Say if they ask you in the application form, how have you identified the need for this project? You put in a bit of a blurb on the application form, and then say please reference full details of our consultation process and our analysis in section 3 of our feasibility study attached. If it's a large scale project. Tax clearance, they normally look for they will look for your tax reference number and your tax access number. If you're getting any grant, you have to be tax compliant. Okay, if you're not tax compliant, they're not going to give you taxpayers' money if you're not tax compliant, basically, right? So you have to prove that you're tax compliant. Also, very important point, if you're getting a quotation from a contractor, let's say a builder is doing work for you, you must make sure that they're tax compliant as well. So you need to get a copy of their tax access number when they quote for the work. Okay. Also, when you're actually obviously doing the work, they need to be tax compliant as well. So if you have a situation where Joe Blogg's builder locally is doing works for you and you never ask anything about tax clearance, and they do the work and it comes to payment and you say, Joe, I got your invoice, I'm going to pay you now, but can I get a copy of your tax clearance or your tax access number? And Joe says, geez, Tom, I haven't done the tax clearance tax return in 2 years. I'm not tax compliant. Now you're in serious trouble because you can't draw the grant because that contractor who you're giving the money to isn't tax compliant. Okay. So if they're giving out public funds, which are tax, Csp funding, the groups have to be tax compliant and the contractors receiving money have to be tax compliant. You need to prove that they're tax compliant at the date they submit the quotation. And that's becoming more difficult now because years ago, you get a tax clearance cert for the year. So you get a certificate saying you're tax compliant for 12 months. And once you had that in place, it didn't matter if you did no return in the period, that tax cert was up to date. Now it's based on tax access number. So the tax clearance process is ongoing. So if someone forgets to or doesn't submit a return in time and revenue spotted that they're not done any returns, they won't issue them tax clearance because there's outstanding returns to be made. And anyone can go into Revenue Online Services with the access number and see is this person or this organization tax compliant. So make sure you keep on top of that. Policies and procedures, if they're requested, you need to normally tick a box and you're signing a declaration form saying these are in place. They're not asking for copies of them, but you need to have copies on file if they come down and audit you. Okay, so if you get a grant, so if the Peel, for example, who you're funding Train Links, if they give Kerry PPN a grant, they can come down at any time afterwards, or a government department official can come down any time afterwards and look for the training file, and all the paperwork that was signed off on has to be in place. So if they have put down, or we have all these policies in place, and tick the box, they have to show them that if they're inspected. Insurance, again, if you're looking at, say, equipment, if you're looking at, say, capital projects, again, you have to show that your project is insured. It's covered under your public liability insurance. In some cases, the department will look for indemnity on the insurance. You'd have to have on your insurance policy, you'd have to show that they're indemnified. So your broker or your insurance company will put in that the department of whatever, or Kerry County Council or the legal company, whatever it might be, are indemnified, are specifically indemnified under this policy. Okay, they will look for that. Okay, so very important again that you're meeting the insurance requirement. And again, this is not something to be like would be told you afterwards. It'd be made very clear in the criteria what they expect. What we also get people to do is to do this thing, which is very important to do. And the reason why it's very important is that most grant applications now will ask for details of previous grants you received, okay? And most people have no idea what they received, or they might have, but they forgot what was for, or they forgot what the amount was, or they forgot the date, or they don't really know what they know it was there, but they don't know have any details of it. What I encourage you to do, any grant you get that you applied for and you get, just use a simple template again, nothing fancy. Write down the grant, where you got the grant from, the date you received it, have to put in the date you received it, okay? The purpose of the grant, what was for, the amount of the grant that you got, and the percentage, so what percentage of the project was that. This is just, they won't look for this in the grant application, but something for you to put in anyway, because if you forget or if you haven't got certain information, you can always go back to them after and say, look, we need a reference number for the grant. We can't find it. Can you give us a reference number that was assigned to that grant back in 2019 or something, right? They'll have that in file, or should have it in file. Was it drawn down? Yes or no? And what matching funds you provided. This one, again, isn't probably relevant to the application, but again, you might as well put in that detail while you're at it. A lot of groups we work with, when I go back to them and say, okay, can you give me a list of all the grants you received in the last 3 years, because they're looking for it. I need the date they were received and the amount you received. They have to go back through their bank statements to see what was submitted, because they don't keep record of it. Some do, some don't. So just keep record of it, because this will save you an hour's work when you put an application together, because all you're doing is cutting and pasting it from this thing here. Plus, it's a good thing to have in file anyway, for your own financial reporting purposes. But a lot of groups don't, because a lot of groups get small grants and they just don't even put them in anymore. But they will look for it. Needs analysis. What you should show in a needs analysis is simply what you're applying for, what's the money going to be used for, how you identify the need. So did you do a consultation process with the community, stakeholder consultation, what research you've done on the project itself, what would the impact of the project be? Again, it's what we call like a value for money analysis, which they will do. And I say they, the people assessing the application will look at, okay, well, if we give a group down in Killarney 100,000 euros, have they proven to be greater impact there than the group that is in Ballyfermot looking for 100,000 euros? Where's the value for money on it? So you got to show the impact. There's a couple of impacts that we use. We use a economic impact analysis. So that's relevant if it's going to create jobs, if it's a tourism project and it's going to bring tourists to your area, or to your village or your parish, and how much they'll spend in the local area when they're there, and how that'll bring money to the local economy. The social impact, which will be most relevant to the projects you'll be working on. So how will this make a difference in people's lives? Things like rural transport, was a game changer for people in rural areas who didn't have access to transport. They were no longer prisoners in their own home. They could leave their house, go to the local village, go to the local town, the whole social interaction, people on the bus, all that sort of stuff. There's no financial impact on that. There's social impact on it. By providing childcare services in a community, in a village, in a parish, or a town, you provide opportunities for people to have to go to work because they can put their kids in childcare. So that helps the local economy, helps local employment. People go back to further education because now they've got time because their child's in the creche or preschool. After school provision, the impact on that on the children in terms of learning, in terms of socialization, the impact on the parents who know more time as well. So all those things have to be kind of, sometimes hard to measure, but you need to kind of outline them. We also look at the indirect impact, so the impact on the families. So if you take, say, Breeders there from Kerry County Sport, in terms of the support they provide, the fact the person's able to get transport from Tralee to Cork to get treatment, the person and their family who was constantly bringing them every day, or as often as needs to go, that person now is a bit more free time, that they're not relying to them. That's an impact, so the indirect impact. If you provide respite care services for a family, for an elderly relative or a sick child or a person with disability, you're freeing up that family to do other things. They have more time to do other things. There's an indirect impact there. So by providing a service for the person that's getting the service directly has an indirect impact on the parents and siblings of that family. You got to measure it, okay? Because it's a real impact. And you got to justify that as well. It's not making things up, saying, "Oh yeah, look, sure, if we build it, they'll come and it'll be great." That's not going to work. You guys know how it's going to, We did an application there for a group, a GA club who wanted to put a walking track around their pitch, It was primarily for their own purposes, so the players could train on it because it was all weather. But they said, look, that the local community would benefit too because they're going to walk around the perimeter track. And the argument was that this was a rural club. All the roads in the area outside the village core were rural roads with no footpaths, no lighting, so people couldn't walk on the roads. There was no place to walk in the community. They had to drive to the nearest town to want to go for a walk. And nighttime they couldn't do that. This was a club providing floodlit, safe, kind of boring because you're going around in laps, running track, walking track. They showed the community impact of it and got the funding. But primarily the back of their head, this is for our club and for our members to run on. But there was further impact to the community. Then they worked with the local school. The local school, this is fantastic. We can now get kids out and it's all weather around the track and we get them exercise and walking and get them out for half an hour every day, and then it impacted on childhood obesity and all this stuff was brought into it. So this one project, they showed the impact across the community in terms of how it will make a difference. How you sustain the project? So again, we always ask this question, if you get the money, how are you going to sustain it? So again, we've got a fundraising plan in place for it. We've got volunteers who will operate the service. We'll maintain ourselves, whatever it might be. You've got to show how you're going to do it, and then how much you need. And again, you might think that's an obvious one. We've got groups from us saying, Tom, we need about 100,000 euros, and the reality is you need probably 500,000, to do a project. So you need to think it through in terms of how much you actually want, because in certain cases as well, that the grant might be just too small. You might need 20,000 euros and the maximum grant is 5,000 euros. There's no point applying for it. If you go into the bank looking for a mortgage for a house and the house is 300,000 euros and they say, based on your income, you can get 100,000 euros, you're not going to argue the point. They're going to say, okay, you want, so we give it to you. You can't do it. You got to find another house. So, if you go in looking for a grant for something way above what the maximum is, they won't go near it. If you're looking for a grant, and the maximum grant is 100,000 euros, and you're looking for 2,000 euros, it's probably too small a project for them to be looking at. So you just make sure that you know how much you need and is what's available relevant to us, and is it available to us. The structure, hugely important again when you're putting an application together, because you're not just applying for a project, you're asking them to give your organization money, so they need to trust you. Okay, so it's like anti-ants. If you look for a loan from a bank, they're not going to say, they want to know, are you capable of actually repaying this thing? So the first thing we will look at is in every structure, and we talked about this last week in the governance workshops, is the experience of the people around the table. Okay, particularly if you're looking for a lot of money for a capital type project where there's building works involved, construction works involved, and you're sitting there as a bunch of volunteers and you've no idea about building, the idea about engineering, the idea about architecture, and you're basically saying to the funder, we could be opening ourselves up here for complete, abuse by the people who work for us, because we've no idea what's happening. We could be getting a decent quote in, we don't know if it's a good quote or a bad quote, we don't know what work they're doing. So you show that for the purpose of this project, we brought on board people with key experience of managing building projects, project managers, architects, engineers, developers, whoever it might be, from the local community, who are going to basically support us with this process. That's giving them assurance that there's someone around the table that kind of know what they're looking at. Okay, track record. This is what we've done over last. What we do with some groups is we kind of know the historical timelines and what they've achieved over the last 10 years. I was in a school yesterday in just outside Tralee, a national school. I was talking to the principal of the national school, and he brought me around and says, this is what we did back in 2013, this is what we did in 2015, this is what we did last year, and this is what we're going to do now over the next 5 years. I thought, this is fantastic. If I'm a government minister, or if I'm in the department, and these guys are looking for money, I'm thinking, these people on their board, on their management committees, their parents' council, everything else, they said they were going to do X, Y, and Z, and they bloody well did it, and did it themselves. And they're, I trust they're going to do the next two projects as well, because they've shown that they can do it, and without any fuss and without any fanfare, and they've raised the money locally and they've done everything else, and they're debt free. That's what you want to see. So I'd like going, that group will have no problem getting funding on the line. The structure, is it just two people making all decisions? Is there a proper structure in place? Is it very transparent? Is it very accountable? Is there good decision-making processes in place? Because a lot of funds, a lot of projects, and I know this and you know this, is two people over a cup of coffee or something stronger saying, this would be a great idea. This project would be fantastic. I think we should do this. And off they go and they run with us. And very often they'll get the funding to do it. But that's not sustainable long-term. You just say, okay, we sat down as a committee, we looked at all the pros and cons, We debated, for a long time. We went out to the consultation. We asked the questions. We asked G as a department, and we've come to the conclusion, yeah, this is something we should do, and something we can do, and something that's sustainable, and we can back that up. That's what you want to show. Management and evaluation. How are you going to manage the project? What sort of evaluation do you have in place? Again, some applications look for this. How are you going to evaluate the program and project? How are you going to evaluate how the money is spent? How are you going to measure the success of the program? What sort of performance indicators you're going to put in? And what you go, what the hell is that all about? You have to show it, because again, they need to, as a department, the people who are giving the funding have to go back to their funders and say, look, we give out X amount of million euros. This is always spent. They don't want to do the evaluations. They don't want to do the reporting on it. They're expecting you to come back and say what you did with money and what difference it made. Okay, so in other words, they want you to evaluate the program. Caroline in Kerry PPN, the wheel will be looking for an evaluation at the end of this program, and we'll say how many people attended each workshop, what was the impact of the workshop on them, have you evaluations done to say, like, we thought the workshop was good, bad, or indifferent, what was the learning from it, have they identified, people that they want to identified any other future supports they can provide. That goes back to the wheel. They collate all that from all the organizations, and then they say, look, yeah, we can prove that the money we got from the government was spent well. Give us more money and we'll do another trainings program next year. Okay, but they want you as an organization to do the evaluation. Caroline, you raise your hand there?
No, it's a funny aside, Tom, because the wheel just wanted an interim report back to them by 12 o'clock today. So I just stepped out for a moment to send it off, because you're absolutely right that when you're getting funding, that you need to make sure to keep all your information, that when they request the information, you have it there to send back to them as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing, they keep that information on file for 5 years, because they could look at a government department to be audited in 3 years' time. We did a project there for leader from the project with NEWKD 5 years ago. It was probably the messiest project we've ever worked on, because it was just, they did it by direct labor, and it was just loads of invoices, loads of quotations, a difficult one to manage, to be honest. But it was done, and the work was done, everything was done and completed. I got a phone call from a development officer in NEWKD one day. He said, Tom, you're not going to believe this. We've been audited down from Pobble and the department, and they decided they picked 5 files at random. Guess what file they picked? They picked the file that was the problematic project, and it was an absolute nightmare. But look, thankfully, it was all fine. But the paperwork was just, and look, luckily we kind of spent time and getting the paperwork right. But if we hadn't to write, we were in serious trouble, And that was, like, it was 3 years after the project, and it was like everyone was sweating, like, there was a lot of sleepless nights that week getting stuff ready for it. But it can be, so they can come back at any time and evaluate it. But again, they're not doing this just to annoy you. They're doing it because they're also evaluated by their funders, and also the government ministers as well. So a minister will be questioned in the Dáil about, money being spent on certain projects. They have to come back and say, well, the money was spent in good ways, and this was the impact of it. So they look for it. But you put in, and this is some of the kind of tricks and tips, you put in your application form how you're going to be kind of a good student in class, and how your reporting is going to be really, really good, and how you're going to evaluate it properly. So now they trust you. You've clearly stated to them that you've got a very clear way of evaluating the success of the project and measuring impact. That ticks a box for them, because they say, well, these guys are going to do our work for us now. Okay, so you've got to give them as much information as possible that makes them comfortable about dealing with you, and that's something that they want the least amount of work possible at the end of this process. When it comes to drawdown, they want to make sure that everything's going to be really easy for them. And if you kind of show that hinted within your application that you will make their life easier, of course, we're human. We're going to go with the person who can make life easier. Again, show you got experience managing public funds. Huge one. Okay, it goes back to the list of funds you've already received, and you manage them all properly. So what we normally put in there is that over the last 10 years, we've consistently, secured public funds. We've managed it effectively and efficiently. We've always achieved projects in budget and on time, and we've no outstanding debt. A line like that is like brilliant. These guys know what they're at. And you can keep it simple. There's no point putting 4 pages how you're fantastic at managing public funds. Bullet point to keep it very straightforward. Because the more you put in, and the more you say about something, in my opinion, if I'm looking at something, the more someone's talking about a specific thing within an application, the more I'm thinking they're bullshitting really within it. Excuse language, but that's what I'm thinking. They're just kind of trying to over-egg this slightly. They're trying to kind of over-explain it. Keep it simple, bullet pointed. That's all they want. They're reading loads of applications. They're assessing many, many applications. Keep it straight to the point and simple for them to review. The strategic context. And this is something, again, it was something years ago that we used to do anyway, with all our applications we used to work on, because it gave us kind of gave the groups we're working with an advantage, or that slight edge in terms of justifying why they should get funding over another group. However, in most applications now, and certainly for the larger scale capital funding projects, they will ask you, how does your project align with local, regional, national policies? Okay, and you might think, how are we supposed to answer this? Simply, you need to start downloading the local, regional, national policies. Okay, so it starts off with the top one, which is not on the list, of course, is National Development Plan. So that's kind of the overarching document for everything. That's where everything's based on. This one is probably the biggest one for us living in rural Kerry. This is the most important document that you need to be referring to. Our rural future rural development policy 2021-2025. This is basically all the objectives and policy objectives that the government are looking at over the next 3 years now, in terms of where their priorities in terms of investment into rural Ireland is going to go. Okay, so all the funding that you see coming up is all linked back to this, right? So there's been a lot of funds being made available for enterprise centres and for remote working hubs across the country. There'll be more coming on board this year for that as well. All that's because there's a big section in this that the future of rural Ireland is about remote work because of COVID. Okay, but if we want to get people working remotely in the areas, we need the proper broadband, we need the proper facilities in them. So they're going to invest in and give communities money to invest in these facilities. Okay, if you're looking at outdoor recreation scheme, it's all about promoting outdoor recreation and recreation infrastructure in rural areas. Greenways popping up everywhere. We're very fortunate in Kerry to have 2 on the go, and we've tried 3 on the go, and smaller ones that are hubbing off that. From a tourism point of view, look at the policies around tourism. We're a coastal county, hugely important. A lot of emphasis on looking at marine strategy in terms of tourism opportunities on the water, so water-based activities, blueways, all this kind of stuff, right? So we tap into that. So we say, okay, and that's what we do. We say to them, as a government, you said you want to do X, Y, and Z. This is your policies. As you'll see, our project here locally in County Kerry, what we're doing is helping you achieve those policies. Okay? In other words, they're saying we're going to do this, we're going to put funding towards it. You're saying we're in the best position to deliver on it. Give us the money, we'll do it. Okay, that's what we're trying to show them. So you look at the county development plan. So the county development plan is currently being is open for public consultation. I don't know if you've seen it or not, if you've got time to read it or not, but I would certainly recommend that you do. Okay, absolutely. And you put your submissions that are saying, okay, well, we're not really too happy with the wording of this, or we think this should be included in it. Now is your chance to get your say on how that's formulated, because that county development plan would be basically the kind of blueprint for policy within the county over the next number of years, next 5 to 6 years anyway. In other words, what you're doing has to reflect what's within the county development plan. If it's not, you can't really. If you're looking for funding from county council in 2 years' time, under, say, community activities fund or community support fund, you've got to be able to refer back to what strategy within the county development plan this relates to, okay? Because they're not going to fund it otherwise. Your county's tourism strategy and action plan, again, if you're in tourism, your local area plans for your municipal district areas, the outdoor recreational plans, climate action plans, very important going forward for large-scale capital projects. You have to show how the funding that you're getting, the building you're developing, is going to reduce carbon emissions and be environmentally friendly green building. So you get additional marks for things like putting in solar, renewable energies for heating, LED lighting, car charging points, all this sort of stuff. You know, super insulated buildings will get extra works because it's supporting climate action objectives. Tight towns groups now, before it was all about hanging baskets and nice looking flower beds and all that kind of stuff. Now it's all about biodiversity. You know, where's your biodiversity plan? You know, there are see weeds now growing in roundabouts than seeing, you know, nice kind of, you know, plants that are and you know, pretty flowers growing them, because it's not supported by biodiversity. So all these things are coming up, and you need to make sure that your projects are mirroring them. Okay. So what we do is, and it seems like a very complicated thing to do, and trust me, it's not. We do this. Now that looks fierce complicated, right? What we do is we kind of make it very clear and visual to them that the project that we're working on meets local, regional, national objectives, right? So what we do is a very simple template like this. right? That's a more complicated one, but this is a simple one. So we put in the policy documents that are relevant to this project. So County Development Plan, Ireland 2040, the Local Economic Community Plan, or Rural Future, whatever it might be, right? And we write down the relevant objectives from these documents that are relevant to our project. And then we put down what actions we're doing will help achieve these objectives, okay? Now, these documents can be 200 or 300 pages long. I'm not expecting you to download them all, read them from cover to cover, unless you're really bored and you've insomnia, because we'll cure it. But they're detailed, very difficult reads. They are. Trust me, I don't read them from cover to cover. Never have done. Never will do. What I do is, if someone comes to me and says, "Tom, we're developing a recreation project in our village. We're putting in a recreational park. We're putting in a playground, whatever it might be." I'll go to all these documents and I'll download them as a PDF document. And I'll search in the PDF document for keywords. I'll put in recreation. I'll put in playgrounds. I'll put in play policy, young people, whatever it might be, right? I'm not going to put in housing because it's relevant to me. I'm not going to put in sewage and infrastructure and car parking and water and bin collections and all this stuff. It's not relevant to me at all, right? I'll put in what's relevant to me. So we do a lot of work with rural enterprise projects around enterprise facilities and enterprise centres that we're involved with ourselves, and we do work for other groups as well in getting buildings for remote working hubs and things like that. So I put in remote working enterprise centres. I put in keywords, and then what I do is I literally cut and paste the relevant sections out and I put them into a separate document. Okay, and I keep them aside. Okay, and then what we do is when it comes to writing the application, we do this. So this is an example of Arkfert Community Centre. We did an application for them under the RDF for their sports facility out in Arkfert. Their football pitch that they developed and their astro pitch that they developed and their full-scale sports facility that's going to be unbelievable when it's finished. And there was a couple of things that they were looking at there. So there was National Development Plan at the time. There was Southern Region Assembly policies, Kerry County Development Plan at the time, the Local Community Economic Plan at the time, and the Tralee Municipal District Local Area Plan at the time. All right, this goes back to 2000 and is it 18, I think, 17, 18. And we said the outcomes of this project will have, they provide sport and recreation space, they provide accessible facilities for people with disabilities, they expand their community facilities for support older people. So the plan here was that their new facilities in Arkfert would allow them to use their existing community centre Arkfert for other purposes because they'd have a new sports facility, no sports centre. So they meant they could do other works with their existing building in the village. It would allow them to expand the facility to support young people. It would promote local heritage because we were going linking the project with the cathedral and the abbey in Arkfert. It will create job opportunities because you will create employment. It will create co-working space because again they could utilize some of the existing space as now co-working space in the village, and it would expand the community council as a social enterprise. Okay, so these were the outcomes of the projects, and we went back to what we did in terms of looked at every policy document, and we wrote down the objectives. These are the objective numbers, so NPO 26, 30, etc., and we wrote down what objective was supported by these outcomes. Okay, so very visually, if you're sitting there thinking, Jesus, these guys are ticking an awful lot of boxes here. No, are they going to go into SC 22 and check was this objective in that document and is it matching what they say? No, probably not. Okay, but you still wouldn't make it up, like not going to put in random make up numbers here. We actually spent, I think, probably a day from start to finish going through all these and say, okay, this is relevant to this, is relevant to this, and it does that take that time. There's a multi-million-euro project, so we're going to spend that time doing it, okay? The thing is, though, this is the most important point, you do this once, you don't have to do it again. All these documents are a 4-year period, 5-year period. They don't change. Okay, so you're not going back every year to do this exercise. Once you do it once, it's done then because they're set in stone for the next 5 years. They're only reviewed in 5 years' time. Okay, so there's a bit of work involved at the beginning, but then after that, there's not. This is hugely important because now from now on, they'll ask you, how is these words, we're doing an application moment, and the question is, how does your project align with strategic policy? In other words, how is it relevant? And when you're looking at they're looking for impact analysis, they're asking what the strategic impact of your project is. In other words, how it's going to impact on their national policies, local policies, regional policies. So it's really important when you're gathering, preparing for your applications, getting this sort of thing done. It seems like an awful lot of work, but once it's done, you don't have to worry about it anymore. But it'll give you serious marks when you're looking at applying for your grant. For example, if you're doing a sports capital application as a sports organization or a school applying for sports capital, you need to go back to the Sports Council's strategic plan. you need to go back to the RFU if you're rugby, FEI if you're soccer, GA if you're football, Basketball Association if you're basketball, etc., etc., etc. And what we do is if we're doing a sports cap application for a club and they want to build additional dressing room facilities, we'll say to them, okay, well, how are you doing that for? Because we've more young girls playing the sport, with more girls getting involved, and we need to have separate dressing rooms for female, male. What we'll do is we put in the application that, we put in the stats in relation to the dropout of participation in sport by young girls when they reach certain ages, and how it's government policies to increase participation in sport with girls that are between, say, 12 and 18, and get more girls involved in sport at national level, which is national policy. It's a huge issue nationally. We say we're doing that because we're putting in dressing rooms specifically for female dressing rooms for girls, so they can play sports and they can get involved in training. We're bringing in female mentors in. We're bringing in coaching there. We're bringing in a female development officer, and we're working with the local girls' schools, all that kind of stuff, right? And we were saying to them, and this fits in with the policies under Sports Council, Department of Sports, all this, okay? In other words, they're saying we want to do this. We're saying give us the money and we'll help you achieve it. Okay, no point in promoting sports to girls in the community and going to local girls' school and saying, come on, join our club. And they go to the club and there's 2 dressing rooms, and they have to change at home and come, because there's no separate facilities for them, or there's no proper structures in place. So we're saying we'll build infrastructure and we can do this. And that's why we're looking for the money. So we go back to them and show them the policies that's matching. Okay, so the matching funds requirements then is the other part you kind of prepare for. So again, what percentage of funds will be required? That will be clearly stated in the criteria. Normally, most funds will look for a minimum of a cash contribution. So they might look for, say, 20% matching contribution. 5% of that has to be cash. In other words, they want to see that you have some cash raised, that you're not completely reliant on grants and loans for this. Okay, so the options that you will need to look at. So money held in your account. Okay, so they'll want to see a bank statement showing the money is sitting there in your bank account. Now, that might be separate from your current account. It might be a development account or a projects account, whatever. It doesn't matter what account it is. Just make sure that the account that the money's sitting in matches the name of the group that's applying. Some groups have a number of different kind of like structures within their organization, and the account name might reflect the actual company name. So it might be, let's say, a building account, or it might be, clubhouse account or something like that. Just make sure that the name of the actual applicant group is on the account statement. That would show what funding is available towards the project. If, for example, you need to show matching funds of €5,000 and your bank statement shows €45,000 sitting there in the account, you need to put in a note saying that of this €45,000, we're taking €5,000 towards a project. The other €40,000 is going to be used for ongoing operation costs, whatever it might be. Okay, so if you have a lot of money sitting in your account, you've got to explain why you're not putting more money towards the project, because obviously you'll ask that question. If it's a loan, which a lot of cases will be, you will need to have that loan approved. So some funders have a loan template that's been completed by the bank and stamped by the bank and dated. Others will just basically accept a letter from the bank or loan approval in whatever format they give it. So a loan approval letter from the bank. Years ago, the local bank manager who might be involved in a group might do up a letter saying that these are a great group, we have no problem giving them a loan down the line. That's not accepted anymore. The loan has to be approved and in place and approved, not drawn down, but approved. Okay. In kind, again, property valuations, voluntary labour contributions, again, you need to look at what their requirements are to prove those are in place, and then the different reporting requirements. The main point I'm trying to get across is that saying we've got matching funds isn't good enough. You need to back that up with proof that you've got matching funds. Okay, that's really important, because a lot of groups say they have and they don't, and they can't apply them because they don't have the documentation to back it up. In terms of procurement and tendering, and quotations, again, which you need to have prior to the application process or application deadline. If it's less than 5,000, as I said, in verbal quotations will do. It's best practice to get more than one quotation anyway. So even if they only ask for one, you should look for 2 or 3. Between 5 and 25K, it's going to be 3 quotations. Each of those suppliers that you're asking to quote have to have the same email. So it's not one standard email to everyone saying, please quote for the following, and give them a proper tender brief. So the draw tendering or given a quotation for the exact same thing. So sometimes the contractors will come back, look for further information. If they look for further information, so let's say Joe Blogs looks for further information and you give that information to Joe, you have to then submit that further information to the other people as well. So they've all got the opportunity to quote on the same thing. You give them a deadline. So say, okay, 5 o'clock Friday evening is the deadline to get the quotations back. They have to be emailed back. You can ask them to be posted back as well. Do it by email, it's easier because it's easier to track it. And you say, okay, the emails have to come back by 5 o'clock Friday and need to be signed by the person. Okay. If they're not signed quotations, you're going to have problems later on in the application stage because they need to be signed. You then keep a copy of the email that you received. I normally do print out of it and keep that file as well with the quotation. So if they look for proof that it came in by the deadline, give that proof there. If it's over 25,000 euros, you got to go on e-tenders and go through the tendering process, which can be complicated enough. There is very good guidelines on the tenders website and tutorials on how to do it. But it can be complicated enough. But if it's over 25,000 euros, you have to go to tenders, which means open to anyone to apply. So just be careful with that you're meeting the procurement guidelines, because you might get away with it at the application stage. You might actually notice it. It's normally at the drawdown stage is where you get the problem, because you might have got a quotation, say from Tom O'Leary, gives you a quotation, and then 2 months later you call me up and say, Tom, we got the grant, when are you ready to start? I said, oh, geez, I just got too much work. I can't do it now. I'm not in a position to do it. No, you got to get the contract to someone else. That causes problems. Okay. No, it wouldn't happen to me. If you're going to a builder, for example, the way it works at the moment, because they're flat out. So look, when you asked for a quote 3 months ago, the landscape has changed considerably. No, we can't get to do it till next September. Now you got to go back and look for someone else. If it's equipment, and this causes massive problems with Brexit and with the delay in supplies, you might have got a quotation from Amazon, for example, or Harvey Norman's or whoever for equipment, and you go to actually look to pay for the stuff because you now got approved for the grant. They might have that equipment in stock anymore. Now you got to go back to your funder and say, look, we put in a quotation from the supplier. They no longer stock it. Can we have permission to change supplier? You will have, but you need to do that before you actually submit any paperwork, because if you don't, then you're going to have problems drawing the grant on. Then this on leader funding, just very, very quickly, just give an example of the stuff they look for. So again, they have capital grants, analysis and development grants, they have training grants also. I'm not going to go through that because that's the last program, again, in terms of all the type of projects they would fund. But one thing I want to kind of show is this, and the reason I brought up is this. This is how they assess, leader assess their applications, okay? So all the stuff we talked about this morning wasn't really just me saying it for the sake of saying it. The reason why I say there's so much work involved in preparing for grants is because they assess your application based on the work you present to them and what you present in terms of the rationale for the project, etc. This is the one that's used by Leader on their evaluation committee scoring sheet. This will be similar to all the other funders, okay? Some funders will give you the criteria and the weighting system and their marking system. Others might, if a small grants, they might necessarily do so. But you see here in terms of the compatibility with the local development strategy, what we talked about strategic context, is it compatible with strategy? And they'll say, well, they didn't really make a point or make a case for it, so we give it a low score, okay? But it's got highest weighting. It's really important that your projects match the national and local strategic context. How innovative is it? That can be difficult for some groups, because some groups do something that isn't innovative, it's needed in their community, but it's not that innovative. They've been always doing it, okay? There's a lower weighting for that, but again, you got to show how it is going to be innovative. And the big thing here is that you got to make sure that there's no other enterprises, in your case, social enterprises or other community volunteer organizations doing what you're doing, especially with local grants. So if you go to Leader and say, we want to provide Meals on Wheels, and they're like going, well, there's already a community group in your parish doing Meals on Wheels. Why are you stepping in and competing with them? They're not going to fund it. So make sure there's no other organization doing what you're doing. If they are other organizations doing what's similar to what you're doing, you got to show how you complement what they're doing rather than compete with them. Promoters' experience, we mentioned already, track record, training, skills, what experience they have to deliver the project. Again, it's not me saying all these things. The workshop this morning, the slides I've shown you have been based on what they look for. Financial viability, discussed it as well. Is it sustainable? Can they co-fund the project? Can they justify the costs? That's actually an important point I didn't say earlier on. Some people say, look, sure, we put in for a project, a capital project, building project, and we're going to say it's going to cost 150 euros a square foot, right? Because that's all we can afford. And it goes to be assessed by the department. And the department will bring in experts from the construction sector and look at averages across the country. And they'll say, well, the average across the country for building of this type is 250 euros a square foot. First, they're thinking is they've underestimated their costs. If we get the money, they won't be able to build it because they want enough money. We won't give them funding. They were unrealistic in terms of their projections. Or they might say, they're looking for way too much money. We can't justify these costs because they haven't been able to justify the project to us. So we just think this is over the top. What they're looking for is way over the top. Okay, so again, you got to be careful that your project is financially viable. That's really, really important. There's 20 of a weighting on that. It's a high mark. Sustainability. After it's over, the project is funded. How are you going to deliver it? How are you going to operate it? Okay, and then the requirement, the market need. How they identified this project and how they identified the need for the project. Okay, is there a market gap there? And you might say, okay, at the moment there is need for childcare in our community because there's no childcare facility. You got to show the number of kids that are in the community that will require childcare, and then you got to look at population projections and analysis over the next 10, 15 years and say the way things are going based on enrollments in national school, based on new families coming to the area, based on housing permission in the area, planning permissions for houses, we presume that there's going to be increase in families, more kids coming to the area, and demand ongoing for childcare. For other services like disability service or cancer support services, unfortunately, we all can say there's going to be always demand there for it. We wish there wasn't, but there always will be. And stats can be shown in terms of increases in number of cases or whatever it might be over the course of a year or 2 years, and said this is always going to be a requirement. And on time, such time that the public sector step in and pay for it, or the private sector, which you never do, will pay for it, there's always going to be need for us to be here. So they're the type of things. We do a lot with sports clubs where they look at their numbers in their academy and how many people they're turning away every year because they've literally no space for them on their facilities. There's not enough pitch room for the kids to play on a Saturday morning, and they say we're turning 30, 40 kids away every year. We need the space. We can justify there's a need for it. Then you got groups where there's no one playing the game. They're still looking for funding, for facilities, and they're going, can't justify it. There's no one, there's no one here anyway. So it's got to make sure that you do all. And this point I'm talking this morning is this isn't about writing the application form. This is about having all your documentation ready for the application form, which is the key thing. Because you don't have, it's like baking a cake. People come to me and say, Tom, can you write the application for us? Can you do this? Of course I can. But I'm only making a cake for them. They got to bring all the ingredients. Without the ingredients, there's no cake. Without the information, without the research done, you won't have enough detail to put into your application form. Unless you lie and you write an application based on fiction, that's going to be cut off either at the application assessment stage, or worse, when you actually get approved for a grant and you realize, they gave us the money. We've no idea what we're going to do with it, and now we're in a situation we can't draw it down. Okay, so it's not about lying, it's not about making stuff up. Everything has to be done based on what's reality. Okay, so that's the end of the present slide. Been slightly over time, so apologies for that. I'm just going to check the chat here because there was some question. Okay, draft development plan. Yep. So that's the draft development plan. I think the deadline, Caroline, is February the 20th, isn't it?
The 23rd. But
okay.
I suppose myself, Eamon, and Catherine White made a small little video of how and why to make a submission, because it's exactly what you were saying, Tom. If it's not in the county development plan, which is running for the next 6 years, that's exactly what they're going to look at if you're going to be sending in an application as well. And we already had one group contacting us going, they never realized, they never connected with the importance of making a submission. So we're just, the PPN included, we're busy putting a submission in place because they're all very interconnected as well.
Yeah, I think the two key documents you should have on your desktops would be the county development plan once it's published and signed off on, and our rural future, the rural development policy, because they're the key two documents. There's going to be other documents as well that are relevant to the sector you're working in. So it doesn't matter, if you're working with young people, older people, in sports, tourism, or environmental projects, there will be other policy documents that are relevant to you as well that you need to have. As I said, you don't need to read them from cover to cover. You just basically dip into what's important to you, what's relevant to you. Okay, like we would keep a file. I would keep a file on all the policy documents because they're going to be relevant to different projects we'll be working on. I just dip in and dip out of them, But what you're doing really is you're kind of, and it's cut and paste job. It's not like you're like we literally would cut and paste the actual word for word, the strategy or the objective, and say, ye said you want to see this happening. We are doing it for you. Give us the money, everything will be okay. Just give it to us and let us do it, and we've shown to you we can do it. So that's, really, but before they very rarely would they ask for would that question be asked in application forms 5-6 years ago. So it was always this upper hand that we had, because we'd slip it in anyway and put it out there. Oh, these guys are actually gone above beyond what we asked for. No, they asked for it. No, it's really important. Everything is tied back to national policy. So the next workshop I'll be doing not the next one, which is on Thursday, because that's online fundraising, but the workshop on online applications, that's when I'll be actually going through the application form. Okay. This morning was all about preparatory work, which is the most important part, being ready for the application. The next day is going to be about the clever wording you put in under the various sections on the application form. What do certain questions mean? How much information should you provide? How much information should I provide? And going through the key things around the application, what people are mess up on when they're writing applications. I'll also talk about as well that day as well in terms of how you do the administration, in terms of keeping the files in one location, so you have access to them when you're doing the online application, because everything has to be uploaded in PDF format and uploaded onto the various different portals and stuff like that. So I'll go through that with you on the online application. Have you any question outside what come up in the chat in terms of this morning's presentation? Does it make sense? There's a lot to it, but does it make sense to you?
And Tom, can I just come in, because I see there's 2 in there about just when is the next training. The training that we're having this week on the application, getting your information together, and the online one, they're going to be repeated next week in the evening to give people an opportunity to go on to that one as well. And then we'll also then be starting on I'm just checking out, the 1st of February then is applying for grants online training. And then on the 9th, we have training on grant application process as well. So we're having 2 of each to try and capture as many groups as possible as well. So if you want to check out the PPN website and the newsletter, or give us an email, we'll send you out the information.
Yep, perfect. So any other questions before we finish up? Are you all okay? Okay. No, I'll be emailing out the Carolyn and Emil send out the recording of this, but I'll be sending out the slides as well. And if you have any questions, I said with all the previous workshops, if there's any question on there or any question you have for me in relation to the presentation, my email address is on the last page of the presentation slides. And feel free to email me any question you might have about grants or what's coming up or what you might need to do. And I'll direct you to where the sources are and all that. If I can't direct you to them, I'll find out someone who can. So thanks for this morning. Appreciate your time, and hopefully I'll see you on the future workshops as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for joining us this morning, everybody. It was really a great workshop. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.